Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner again, as always. And today we're going to take a look at a short story by Kate Chopin. I'll make the introduction kind of short too. The story's great, and I think some of you may already be familiar with it. It's a story that's in our textbook, and it's part of this Frontiers unit, but it's another one that gets used other places. And I know some of the 10th grade teachers have used this story as well. It's a story called The Story of an Hour, and in fact, it does have to do with, where's the train? The train's over there. I always get it backwards here. The train's over here. It's a story that has to do with a train to some extent, but it's more a story about, number one, a regionalist writer, although this story isn't necessarily regionalism, but it is a female writer. And this story has to do with feminism. And feminism is another emerging topic in this time period. So let's get started. The title of today's story is The Story of an Hour. And I said it's a short story. And in fact, everything that happens in this story happens in an hour, under an hour. A train does play a part of it. You'll see where that is a little bit later in here. Our question is going to be, how is pioneering feminism evident in this regional story? So I don't think this story is terribly regional. It involves a western part of the country, but I think you could actually set this story probably anywhere. Remember, regionalism is a type of literature which allows people in the cities in the East to experience parts of the country that seem very different. It might be the Wild West, it might be the Yukon area, it might be the swampy areas of Florida or Louisiana, it might be the rocky coast of Maine. This particular story, the plot and the character, your main character, is what it's all about. And you're going to look for those feminist overtones throughout this piece. The reader's journal, the question to kind of get your mind in the right mindset to get started is, when have you experienced an emotion that was considered inappropriate by your friends, your family, or your coworkers? I think this question's kind of interesting because it doesn't say, have you ever experienced? It says, when have you experienced? Whoever wrote this question assumes that we've all felt this. And there are times when we feel a certain emotion rising up in us, and it's not the one we think ought to be rising up in us. Sometimes it doesn't quite fit the situation. Sometimes we keep them secret. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we get into this particular story. So there's an image of Kate Chopin. You'll notice her years there, 1851. She's born about 10 years before the first shots in the Civil War. And just like Chief Joseph, she lives into the 21st century. Both of them, I believe, were 1904. So there's an awful lot of change that occurs in that particular time period that they would have seen. She's born Kate O'Flaherty. Not that that's important. I'm never going to ask you that. She's raised in St. Louis. Again, not that that's particularly important. Her father did die in a train wreck, and our story today features a train wreck. So I don't know if she was dealing with some of those issues or if it's just circumstantial, but I kind of have a feeling it was her own experiences that she was putting into this story. She was raised in a family of women. So she was raised by her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. Her mother was Creole. So Creole is a term we use for those French people who settled down in the Louisiana area, and Creole is sort of a varied version of French. Her mother spoke Creole, and evidently her grandmother was an incredible storyteller. So she grew up in this environment of all women and in an environment of storytellers. So it only makes sense that she would be a feminist storyteller at some point. She married Mr. Chopin. We don't need to worry about his name. And the two of them moved off to Louisiana. And a lot of her writing is regional. So it's fine that your textbook chose her as a regionalist writer. I just don't think that this particular story we're reading is a good example of regionalism today. She had 6 children by the time she was 30. And at the same time she's raising this big family, she starts in with writing. It was actually the family physician who recognized some of her writing skills in letters that she wrote, and he encouraged her to write stories, partly because she was good at it, but partly also as a sort of therapy, as an outlet for some of the emotions that she was feeling, dealing with everything going on in her life. Her husband dies, and once again, she's at the point where she's got to take care of a family, female alone. Feminism comes to the forefront again. She's like, she can do it kind of thing. And she begins a literary career when she moves back to St. Louis. She wrote collections of short stories. Many of them have these feminist overtones. Many of them are regionalist, centering down in the Bayou country of Louisiana. Her most famous novel is called The Awakening. I don't know if we do it anymore. The 10th grade, we had a 10th grade teacher anyway, who used to use that book in 10th grade. It was 1899, so right before the turn of the 20th century, and it focused on feminism. It had ideas about feminism and women standing up and taking rights and making decisions, not always being gentle and ladylike. And it got censored a lot because there were plenty of people who believed that we've got to keep these new ideas from coming to the forefront in America. All righty. And I think I've told you everything that's on this slide here. Yes, in fact, I had, so we can skip that one and we can go on right there. Our literary tools for this piece that we're doing today. Irony is nothing new. I know we've talked about irony a bunch of times. The general definition of irony is it's the difference between expectations and reality in a piece of literature. We've talked about verbal irony, where what a person says isn't actually what a person means. We've had irony of situation, where lots of little details come together in the story to sort of lead the reader into thinking one thing is about to happen when something else really happens. And then there's dramatic irony. And you probably first talked about dramatic irony when you were in 9th grade and did Romeo and Juliet. But dramatic irony doesn't have to occur only in a drama. The idea in dramatic irony is it's when the reader knows certain things that the characters in the story do not know. It's that don't open that door in the horror movie kind of thing. And so as the reader, you can see a little more deeply into what's going on than the characters who are acting in the story. The other term that we have is something that's going to be very important to us as we move into the 20th century. And it's a concept in a story called reversal, sometimes called reversal of fortune, where everything is moving along in a certain way. Maybe a character is having lots of good luck, falling in love, getting a house, and then something happens and everything comes crashing down. That's called a reversal. It can go the other way too. You can have a character who's just dealing with strife and struggle, and something happens, maybe winning a lottery ticket or making a right choice, and everything turns around and things turn the other way and life gets good. It makes sense. It's just the general direction of one's life, and suddenly it turns around, and we call that reversal or reversal of fortune. Now, you're going to read the selection before you go over the check for understanding questions. As you read the piece, look for any examples of regionalism that you can find. Like I said, I don't think this is a very good example of regionalism. You have references to trains and things, and they were certainly more important as you got out onto the frontier, but we had trains all along the East Coast at the time as well. You will see examples of feminism. In fact, that's really what this story's all about, so that'll be no problem. Look for the irony, and more than one type of irony. Don't just look for the dramatic irony. Look for dramatic irony, but also look for verbal irony. There's some in here. And look for irony of situation. There's plenty of that in here as well. And then, of course, reversal. So this is the point. If you have not read the story yet, you should pause this video and you should go read the story. I'm going to wait while you go read the story. Have you read the story? You're sure? Okay, let's go on. So we have some true and false questions. First, number one, Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with heart trouble. True or false? That's true. That's key to the story. You have to understand that from the very beginning. Everyone treats her in a gentle kind of way, trying to protect her from any sort of shock because they're afraid of what shock could do to her heart. Number two, Mr. Mallard, her husband, was killed in a railroad accident. True or false? Yeah, she thinks for much of the story that he was. In fact, the other characters were as well. It's only at the end of the story that we find out that that information was wrong. So this doesn't say Mrs. Mallard thinks that Mr. Mallard was killed in a railroad accident. It just says was, and he was not. Number 3, Mrs. Mallard is excited by the possibility of freedom. And that's absolutely true. After she gets over the initial shock of learning that her husband is dead, the first words that escape her lips are, well, first word actually, is free. She realizes she no longer has to be that obedient spouse tied to her husband's wishes. Now, you have to remember, in the 19th century, property belonged to the men. When a woman with property married a man, it all became his. It was extremely difficult even for a woman to take a challenge into a courtroom, because women were not permitted in courtrooms. Men had to go represent them in courtrooms. So she's excited by the possibility of not being tied to a husband. It doesn't mean she didn't love him. In fact, she's quite clear she had always loved him. And she knew that when the day came that she was going to have to look at his body in the casket at the funeral, tears would once again come. But it doesn't mean that she also isn't excited by the freedom that's coming her way. Now, number 4 is kind of a difficult true-false. I don't like true-false questions myself because it's too easy to read into them and come up with a different answer. But Mrs. Mallard is devastated by her husband's death. Well, at first she cries and she goes off to her room. And then she pulls herself together and she starts to realize the joy that's coming. But then ultimately she realizes that he's not even dead. So how would it be possible to be devastated by her husband's death? So it's a difficult question for true and false, but false is probably the best answer there. And number 5, Mrs. Mallard dies from the joy she experiences upon seeing her husband. And there's where the irony comes in. That is false. Again, this is dramatic irony now. Anyone else who witnessed what happened, she believes her husband's dead. She went off to her room to cry. She gathers herself together. She's coming down the stairs. And all of a sudden, her husband walks through the door alive. Her poor heart gives out from the shock, and she dies. Everyone who witnessed it assumed that it was joy. In fact, they said she died of heart disease from a joy that kills, because the shock of joy was so dramatic irony. You were with her in that room upstairs. You know what was going through her head. You knew the years she saw ahead of her being free without being tied to a husband. And so that's what dramatic irony is. All right, we have some sentence completions here. Just fill in some names. You need the name, I don't know why this is important, but you need the name of Mrs. Mallard's sister, and that was Josephine. She is the one that told Mrs. Mallard that her husband had been killed in that train wreck. Number 2, Mr. Mallard's friend, what? First received the report of Mr. Mallard's death. This is one of these guys who, like, he's a friend of the family and he feels like he's got bad news. No one should deliver this bad news but him. And so he rushes off to deliver the bad news. And his name was Richards, not Richard. It's his last name. This is a formal story, so we know everybody by their last names, not their first names, except for Josephine for some reason. Number 3, the first word Mrs. Mallard says in her room, and I let this slip a little while ago, is free. She thinks she's free of this marriage. Not a marriage that she hated, not a husband that she hated, but still obligations. And she wants to be her own person, not someone else's spouse. Number 4, at the end of the story, who walks through the front door? And of course, that's her husband, Brentley. That's Mr. Mallard. You could have also had Mr. Mallard enters the front door, and that would be good. And number 5, Mrs. Mallard dies of, and this is the dramatic irony, it's heart disease which kills her. She had a weak heart, but it was the disappointment in having all of those years of freedom ripped away from her just like that. Suddenly, no more years of freedom. She's back to being the spouse of another person. And so technically it was heart disease, but it was also the great disappointment of seeing her husband come through that door alive. And that's it for the story of an hour. The story of an hour does not take an hour. It takes about 15 minutes, but you should all be finished. If you have any other assignments to go with this, be sure to check Schoology. You might have a check for understanding quiz. You might have some levels of thinking questions. Make sure you get those in by the deadline. But thanks for staying with me till the end, and I'll see you next time.